The cold came up through my boots before I understood what it meant. I was standing on the gravel path between two rows of headstones. Rain coming down in that thin gray way it does in late October. The kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air and settle on you. And the ground under me was warmer than the air. That's wrong. I want to be clear about how wrong it was, because everything that came after grew out of that one small, impossible thing. It was the kind of night where your breath fogs and your hands go stiff, and the puddles skin over with the first thin ice of the year. Frozen earth doesn't breathe heat. The dirt should have been pulling the warmth out of me through my soles, the way it always did on a late shift, the way it had every cold night for 19 years. Instead, it was giving warmth back. It rose through the leather and the wool of my socks like I was standing on the lid of an oven somebody had left on low. And when I crouched down and pressed my bare palm flat against the dirt beside old Marion Healy's headstone, I felt it pulse. Not a tremor. I know what a tremor feels like. The little shudders the ground gives when a truck passes on the valley road or when the spring thaw shifts the clay. This was not that. This was a pulse, slow and even, rising and falling under my hand with a rhythm I recognized in my own body before my mind would let me name it. It breathed. The ground breathed, the way a sleeping animal breathes, deep and patient, in no hurry at all. I'd worked this cemetery for 19 years. I dug the graves and mowed the grass and fixed the fences and reset the stones the frost heaved every spring. And I had never once, in all that time, felt the ground breathe. And 3 towns over, on the far side of the ridge, people were already eating each other. And nobody on the radio would say the word out loud yet. They called it a lot of things that week. They had not yet called it what it was. I lowered myself the rest of the way down and put my ear flat against the wet dirt, the cold mud pressing against my cheek, the rain ticking on the back of my neck. Under the rain, under the slow thud of my own heartbeat in my ears, there was a hum, deep, mechanical, the patient drone of machinery turning over somewhere far below me, where no machinery had any business being. Underground, I had personally dug and filled and walked over more times than I could count. And the strangest part, the part that climbed up my spine on cold little feet and sat there at the base of my skull and would not leave, was that the hum was getting louder. I want to take 1 second before I go further. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories night after night. And if this is your first time here, you're welcome too. If grounded survival stories are your kind of thing, subscribe and leave a comment and stick with me, because it genuinely helps the channel keep going. Now, let me tell you what was under that graveyard, and why I wish to God I'd never gone looking for it. My name is Tom Reyes. I was 51 years old that autumn, a groundskeeper and grave digger for St. Brendan's Cemetery on the high edge of a town in the back country that I'm not going to name, because there are still people there I don't want anybody finding. I'd taken the job after my back gave out at the lumber mill. 2 ruptured discs and a settlement that didn't last. And everybody I knew figured a cemetery was the kind of place where nothing ever happens. That was the whole appeal, if I'm honest. Quiet work. Honest work. The dead don't complain, and they don't ask for a raise, and they don't show up at 7 in the morning still drunk from the night before. You mow, you trim, you dig, you fill. And the worst surprise you ever get in a season is a tree root the size of your forearm where the plot map swore there'd be nothing but clay. I knew that ground better than I knew the inside of my own house. I knew which sections held water and turned to soup after a hard storm, and which corners stayed firm. I knew where the deer came through the gap in the north fence at dusk to crop the grass. and which old plots had settled so badly over the decades that the stones leaned like men who'd had too much. I knew the smell of the place in every season. The green cut grass smell of summer, and the wet leaf rot of fall, and the clean cold nothing of deep winter. I had buried 400 people in that ground, give or take, lowered them down on the straps with my own hands. And in 19 years, I had never once needed a shovel or a backhoe to go deeper than 6 feet. Because there was nothing down there worth going deeper for. Rock and clay and the long quiet. That was the cemetery. That was the whole truth of it, or so I'd believed every single day until that night. So when the ground started running warm in the back section, the old section, the part with stones so weathered by 100 winters that you couldn't read the names on them anymore, I told myself it was a broken gas line. That was the sensible answer. And I reached for it the way you reach for a railing in the dark. There was no gas line back there. There was no gas line anywhere in the cemetery. The cottage ran on propane from a tank by the wall, and the rest of the place ran on nothing at all. I knew that. I'd dug half that ground myself. But I told myself broken gas line anyway, standing there in the rain. Because the sensible answer is the one a man grabs for when the true answer is too big to fit in his hands. The outbreak was 11 days old by then. 11 days since the first hospital in the city went dark. And the news started using those careful, bloodless words, incident and containment and civil disorder, the way they do when they've decided the truth would start a panic. I'd been watching it come the way you watch a storm that's still out past the ridgeline, telling yourself it'll break apart and lose its strength before it ever reaches the valley. The highway out of the high country was already jammed solid in both directions. Brake lights stacked up for miles in the dark, people fleeing in directions that didn't make sense because there was nowhere left that made sense. The grocery in town had been stripped down to the bare shelving and the wire racks by the third day. My phone still worked, just barely, in that stuttering, broken way where a text might go through if you stood by the window with your arm up and said a little prayer over it. I lived alone in the keeper's cottage at the cemetery's edge, a squat stone building older than most of the graves it watched over, with walls 2 feet thick and a cast-iron wood stove that did more honest work in a winter than the furnace ever did. My wife, Donna, had passed 4 years back. Cancer, the slow kind, the kind that takes a person from you in pieces over 2 years, so that by the end you've already done most of your grieving, and the death itself is almost a mercy. Except it isn't. Not really. We never had children. We'd wanted them and they hadn't come. And after a while, we'd stopped talking about it. So when the world started ending, I found I had nobody to protect and nobody to run for. And that's a thing that does something strange to a man. It makes him calm in a way that isn't healthy. It strips the fear of dying right out of him and leaves something worse behind, something quieter, because a man who isn't afraid for himself or anyone he loves is a man who gets curious when he ought to get scared. That's why, on the 11th night, instead of locking my door and banking the stove and waiting the whole thing out like a reasonable person, I went and got my good flashlight, the heavy aluminum one with the fresh batteries, and my long steel pry bar from the equipment shed. And I walked back out into the cold rain to find out why the dead ground had gone warm. The back section sat against the old stone wall, the original boundary from the days when the cemetery had only been a churchyard, before the church itself burned down in the 40s and they rebuilt it closer to town. The graves back there went all the way back to the 1880s, the founders of the town, the loggers who died young and hard in the timber. A whole row of children, 11 of them, from a single bad diphtheria year, their little matching stones lined up like teeth. I'd always handled that corner with a little extra care, gone a little slower with the mower, trimmed a little more gently around the leaning stones, the way you do with anything that's been left alone long enough to feel like it owns itself, rather than the other way around. The warm patch centered on a flat marker I'd never paid much mind to in all my years there. No name carved on it, just a worn cross and a date that might have read 1911 or 1917. The last digit eaten away by lichen in a century of rain. It lay flush with the ground, a flat slab maybe 3 feet by 5, the kind they sometimes set down over the entrance to a family vault. I'd always assumed it was solid stone over solid ground. I'd mowed across it 1,000 times without a second thought, felt the mower deck rumble over it, and never once wondered. I knelt down in the wet grass beside it and ran my fingertips along its edge, slow. And that's when I found the seam. A hairline gap between the slab and the earth packed around it, thin as a knife cut. And out of that gap came the warmth, steady and damp, carrying a smell with it. Machine oil first, sharp and industrial. And under the oil, something else, something I didn't have a word for yet. Mineral, electric, old, in a way that wasn't like the old of the graves around it, which was a clean, dry old, the old of bone and stone. This was a wet, breathing old, the smell of a place that had been sealed up a long time with something living still in it. I worked the flat end of the pry bar into the seam and leaned my whole weight onto it, the way I'd levered up 10,000 stubborn flat stones over the years, and I braced for the grind and the reluctance, the way old stone always fights you. The slab didn't fight. It moved smooth and even and balanced, swinging up and back on a hinge I couldn't see, lifting easier than the lid of a chest, counterweighted by something underneath. And the warm air came rushing up out of the opening into my face like a held breath finally let go. And below the slab, in the wash of my flashlight, there was not a vault. Below the slab, there were stairs, concrete stairs, clean and modern and poured, going straight down into the dark, with a steel handrail bolted into a poured concrete wall, and set into that wall at even intervals, dropping away below me into the black, were small red lights, dim and steady and burning. Power. 11 days into the end of the world, with the town's grid stuttering and dying and whole counties gone dark. There was something under my cemetery that still had power, and it had it the whole time, humming away under the dead while I mowed the grass over its head and never knew. I stood there in the rain, with the slab standing open at my feet and the row of red lights glowing up at me out of the warm dark. And every sensible instinct I owned told me, plain as a voice, to drop the slab back down, walk to my cottage, bank the stove, and spend the rest of the apocalypse pretending I had never felt the ground breathe. I dug graves over this place for 19 years. Whoever had built it had buried it under a 100-year-old churchyard on purpose, under the one kind of ground that nobody on earth ever disturbs, under the protection of the patient dead. People don't hide a thing that well, that deep, that carefully, unless the thing is worth hiding from absolutely everyone. And that includes a man with a pry bar and too many questions. But the hum was louder now, with the slab open. It rose up out of the stairwell and filled the cold air, that deep mechanical drone. And down at the very bottom of the stairs, right at the trembling edge where my flashlight gave out and the red lights took over, I could just make out a door. A heavy door. The kind you see on bank vaults and old submarines, a great round wheel set into the center of it. And that door was standing open, just a hand's width, just a black gap of shadow at its edge. And from behind it, climbing up the stairwell under the hum, came a sound that I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life, however much of it I've got left. It was a voice. A human voice. Calm and flat and even, repeating something at slow intervals the way a recording does, with the same dead cadence each time. I couldn't make out the words from the top of the stairs, only the shape of them, the rise and fall. But it was speaking, down there in the warm dark under the graves. And it had been speaking, I understood, with a slow, cold horror that started in my stomach and climbed for a very long time. Speaking to no one, speaking and repeating and waiting, for days, for years maybe, for someone to finally come down those stairs and listen. I went down. Of course I went down. I've turned it over 1,000 times since, and the answer is always the same. A man with nothing left to lose and a question burning a hole clean through him will walk into anything, down any stairs, through any door. That's not courage. I want to be clear that it isn't courage. It's something emptier than that. The stairs were longer than they'd looked from the top. I counted as I went, the way I always have when I'm scared and need something solid to hold my mind to, the way I'd count shovelfuls on a hard dig to keep from thinking about the box waiting at the edge of the hole. 31 steps. The concrete was dry under my boots down here, swept clean, no leaf litter, no cobweb, and the warmth wrapped closer around me with every step I dropped, until by the bottom I'd unzipped my wet jacket and the rain on my collar had gone from cold to lukewarm. The smell got stronger as I went. The oil and the ozone and that mineral undertone, and now layered in underneath it all, faint and sweetish and unmistakable. A smell I knew and badly did not want to know, because I'd smelled it in the back room of Holloway's funeral home, on the bad days, the days in a hot August when they'd gotten behind on the work and the cooler had failed. The sweet, thick smell of something that had been a body and had stopped being one. At the bottom of the stairs, the voice was clear. Containment integrity nominal. Specimen viability confirmed. Personnel are reminded that the lower levels remain under Quarantine Protocol 7. Do not open the inner doors. Do not approach the holding cells. This message repeats. A pause. A soft electronic tone, 2 notes falling. Then it began again from the top, in the same flat, patient voice. Containment integrity nominal. I stood in front of the great round door with my flashlight shaking. Just a little. Just enough that the beam trembled on the steel. And I read the words stenciled across it, half worn away, in a faded industrial yellow. Sub-level access. Authorized personnel only. Ridgeline Biological Reserve Station 9. I had never heard of a biological reserve station. Not in the valley, not in the county, not in 19 years of standing graveside while people told me everything about their lives, because grief makes people talk. And the man burying your mother gets told things no priest ever hears. Nobody had ever once mentioned anything like this. Somebody had built a facility under my cemetery, and the whole town had been born and lived and died and been laid down in the dirt on top of it across 100 years. And not one living soul had known. And the calm voice in the dark was still, after all this time, reminding personnel not to open the inner doors. There were no personnel. The dust told me that. A thin, even film of it lay across the floor inside the gap of the open door, undisturbed. The dust of a place where nothing has walked in a long while. Whoever had worked down here was gone. And they'd gone in a hurry, because you do not leave a vault door like that, standing open a hand's width, unless you ran for your life and didn't look back. I should have turned around. I want to be honest about exactly how many chances I had to turn around, because everything that came after is on me, and I won't dodge that. I had the chance at the top of the stairs, with the rain at my back and the slab still in my hands. I had it at the bottom, with the door shut. I had it standing right there, in front of the steel, with the recording telling me, in plain, unmistakable English, not to go in. And I put my hand flat on the cold wheel, and I pushed the door instead. It swung heavy and silent on balanced hinges. No groan, no protest. And the red light of the stairwell gave way to a corridor lit in a cold, hard white, from fixtures set behind wire mesh cages in the ceiling. And the warmth was strongest of all here, pouring down out of vents overhead in a steady current I could feel on my face, and standing in it, I finally understood the heat. Something down here needed to be kept warm. Something needed the air kept at blood temperature, and it needed it the whole time, every day, for years, while the generators burned fuel to give it to them. Something alive. The corridor ran straight ahead for maybe 40 feet, the white lights marching down the ceiling, the vents breathing warm, and it ended at a room. I knew it was a control room because of the bank of monitors set into the far wall, most of them dark and dead, 2 of them still glowing with a pale standby gray. There was a metal desk and a swivel chair lying knocked over on its side on the floor, and a coffee mug sitting on the desk that had grown a thick green fur of mold up its inside walls, and a heavy canvas work coat still hanging on a hook by the door like the owner had stepped out and meant to be right back. And on the desk, lying open under the cold light, was a logbook, the cheap kind, a school composition book with a black and white marbled cover, the pages curling slightly in the warm, mop air. I picked it up. The handwriting changed 3 times as I turned through the pages. 3 different hands keeping the same log over what the dates told me was a span of several years. The early entries were dry as old bone. Temperature readings taken twice a shift, power checks, generator fuel levels, feed schedules, feed. That word turned up again and again, page after page, in all 3 hands. And I didn't like the look of it, but I didn't yet understand it. And then, maybe 2/3 of the way through the book, the handwriting changed again, got smaller and tighter and harder to read. The letters cramped together like the man writing them was running out of room or running out of time, and the entries stopped being dry. The last legible entry was dated 4 days before the first hospital in the city went dark. I'll never forget the words, because I read them 4 times standing there in that warm, white room. It said, "They sent the order this morning to terminate the specimens and burn the records. We cannot terminate what we cannot approach. The inner cells will not respond to gas. The seals are too good. The gas pools in the corridor and does nothing to them. Carrera went down to do it by hand against protocol. He took the bolt gun. Carrera did not come back up. We have stopped hearing him on the radio. We are sealing what we can seal, and we are leaving tonight, all of us. God forgive us. The cells are warm. They will stay warm as long as the generators hold. We did not build a place that ends. We only built a place that waits. We only built a place that waits." I closed the logbook slow and set it back exactly where it had been, as if that mattered, as if neatness could put any of it back the way it was. The recording out in the corridor reminded me again, in its calm, flat voice, not to approach the holding cells, and on the 2 glowing monitors, in that pale, dead standby gray, I could see 2 camera feeds, 2 rooms, 2 cells with thick glass walls, and behind the glass, in each one, something was standing very still and facing the camera. Facing it directly, squared up to it, as if it had been facing that camera for a very long time. as if it had felt the slab lift open 31 stairs and 40 feet and 100 years of packed dirt away, and had turned to face the only eye it had, and was waiting. The way the whole place had been built to wait, for someone like me to come down the stairs. If you'd been standing in that control room, with the cold rain falling 100 feet over your head and the patient dead lying in the dirt between you and the sky, I honestly want to know what you would have done. Because I told myself I'd just look. I told myself that looking, only looking, couldn't possibly hurt anyone. I crossed to the monitors. The image quality was poor, grainy, and washed, the cameras old and the light in the cells dim. But I could see enough. The cells were small, maybe 10 feet square, white-walled, with a steel drain set into the center of the floor, and a low slot near the bottom of each glass wall that I figured was how they'd done the feeding without opening anything. The thing in the left-hand cell stood with its back drawn unnaturally straight, its head cocked over to one side at an angle no comfortable neck holds. And even through the grain, I could see it was shaped like a man, and was not a man. The proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too long, nearly to the knees, and the skin was a dull, flat gray that seemed to drink the light right out of the air instead of giving any back. It did not move. It did not sway or shift its weight or breathe in any way I could see. It held that head-cocked stillness with a patience that nothing living holds, because everything living fidgets, everything living shifts and twitches and tires. This did not. The thing in the right-hand cell was worse, and it was worse because it was moving. Slowly, by tiny degrees. Its head was turning, sweeping, tracking something across the cell. And then I understood what it was tracking. Because there was a third small monitor low on the wall that I hadn't noticed. Dark until that moment. And it flickered to life as some motion sensor somewhere down in the works woke up. And on it, I saw the stairwell. The stairs. The 31 steps I'd come down. And at the very top of them, framed in the open mouth of the slab, was the gray, ragged rectangle of the rainy night sky. I'd left the slab open. The thing in the right cell was tracking the airflow. The current of fresh, cold, wet air pouring down the open stairwell into the long-sealed, warm dark. The first new air this buried place had breathed in 11 days. And that air carried the smell of the rain and the cold earth and the cut grass and me, all of it rolling down those stairs and through the open vault door and into the corridor. And the thing behind the glass had turned its whole body to face the source of it with an attention that there was no mistaking and no softening. It was hunger, pure, patient, 100-year-old hunger, finally given a direction. I left the control room a good deal faster than I'd entered it. I told myself I'd go up and close the slab, seal the whole thing back down tight, walk to the cottage, and spend the end of the world pretending I'd dreamed every minute of it. The recording followed me down the corridor toward the door. Do not approach the holding cells. I was approaching the stairs, I told myself, not the cells, as if the recording cared about the difference, as if anything down in that place cared about anything in the world except the cold new air and the warm living meat moving through it. I made it through the vault door and to the bottom of the stairs, and that's when the lights flickered. Not a flicker like a loose bulb or a bad connection. A long, sick, sliding dimming. All the lights at once. The cold white in the corridor behind me and the dim red dropping away up the stairwell. All of it guttering down together toward nothing, and then dragging itself back up. Struggling, like a man going under and clawing for the surface. And under the steady hum of the machinery, I heard a new sound. A labored mechanical cough and a surge. The exact ugly sound a generator makes when it's burning the last few inches at the bottom of its tank, sucking air, fighting to keep turning. We did not build a place that ends. We only built a place that waits. The cells stay warm as long as the generators hold. I stood at the bottom of those 31 stairs, and I did the math. The cold kind of math I'd had to learn to do too many times in 19 years of burying people, the math of how much, how deep, how long. And the math was simple, and it was terrible. The generators had been running with nobody to tend or refuel them for at least 11 days. They were nearly dry. They were dying right now, under my feet, coughing on the last of their fuel. And when they finally died, the heat would die with them. And whatever those gray things needed the heat for, whatever the warmth did to them, whatever kept them docile and slow and standing patient behind their glass, that would die too. The cold was coming for them. And I had a bad feeling, standing there, that they did not get gentle when they got cold. I went up the stairs, and I closed the slab. I got the pry bar under the lip, and I leaned every pound I had into it, and felt the hidden counterweight take the load and lift it. And the slab swung up and over, and settled back down into the earth with a soft pneumatic sigh, sealing the warmth and the red light and the recording and the patient gray things back down under the dead where they had been hidden for 100 years. I stood over it in the rain, soaked through now and breathing hard, my heart going like a hammer, and I told myself it was done. It was not done. I knew it wasn't, even as I told myself it was, because the slab sealed the stairwell. But the slab didn't put one drop of fuel back in those generators. And a thing built to wait does not wait forever. It waits exactly as long as the power holds, no longer. And then it stops waiting and starts doing whatever it was made to do. I went back to the cottage, and I sat in the dark with the wood stove ticking as it cooled, and I did not sleep. I sat in Dana's old chair by the window with the rifle I almost never touched across my knees. And I watched the black shape of the back wall, and I listened. Toward dawn, the rain finally stopped, and in the new ringing quiet that came after it, I could hear it again. Faint through the floor, through the 2 feet of stone, through 100 feet of clay and rock and the bones of the founders. The hum. And under the hum, every so often, that cough and surge as the generator down there fought another round for its life. I sat there counting the surges the way I'd counted the stairs, and I marked the time between them on the old clock on the mantel, and each gap was a little longer than the one before it. The thing was running down, and when it stopped, the waiting stopped. I had 11 days of an outbreak coming up the valley toward me, and I had a buried facility full of things below me that the people who built it could not kill, could not even approach, and had finally chosen to abandon warm rather than face. The whole town slept unknowing on top of it, and the only living person who knew a thing about it was a 51-year-old gravedigger with a ruined back and a steel pry bar. By the time the sun came up gray over the ridge, I decided I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. Not out of courage. I keep coming back to that because it matters. Out of the plain, practical sense that you cannot plan against a thing you don't understand. And I've always been a man who liked to plan, who needed to plan. I'd spent 19 years digging holes the exact right size, never an inch too long or too short, measured twice and cut once. And I did not do a single thing in this world by guess if I could help it. But the town complicated everything, the way towns always do. Because 2 days after I found the slab, people started coming up the hill to the cemetery. The first was Will Hatcher, a man I'd known the better part of 40 years since we were boys throwing rocks at the mill pond. He showed up at my cottage door at first light with a deer rifle slung over his shoulder and his face gone the gray color of old ash. His truck slewed sideways in the gravel like he'd come up the hill too fast. The infection had reached the valley. Not the city 40 miles off, not the next county. Our valley, our road. He'd seen it himself out on the Tillerson Road. A man he half recognized walking wrong, all wrong. The way I'd seen the gray thing behind the glass move, jerky and tilted and gathering itself. And then the man had moved fast, faster than any man moves, straight at Will's truck. And Will had done the thing Will does, which is the practical thing, and put him down with one round through the windshield. Then he'd driven straight to the highest, quietest, most defensible piece of ground he knew in the whole valley, which was a cemetery on a hill with a real stone wall around it and only one road up. He wasn't the last. Word travels in a dying valley the way fire travels in dry October grass, fast and low and on the wind. By the end of that first day, there were 9 of us behind the stone wall. By the end of the week, there were 23. People I'd buried fathers and mothers and children for. The Cadiz sisters, Rosa and Lupe, who'd run the diner in town for 30 years and bickered the whole time. A young couple, the Vances, Mike and Hannah, with a baby that wouldn't stop crying, a fever the mother couldn't break. Doc Pruitt, 78 years old, half deaf, the only medical training within 20 miles now that the clinic was burning. They came up the hill with what they could throw in a truck bed. And they looked at the stone wall and the high ground and the single road. And they saw exactly what Will had seen. Safety, a place to dig in, a place to make a stand and outlast the thing. And every last one of them set up their tents and parked their trucks and stacked their makeshift barricades directly on top of a buried facility full of gray things that were getting colder by the hour. And not one of them knew it, and I did not tell them. That is the first thing I have to own, and the one that sits heaviest. I did not tell them. I told myself it was because they'd panic, that a frightened crowd is a more dangerous thing than any quiet threat. That what earthly good would it do for 23 terrified people to learn they were camped on a lid that was coming loose? All of that was true, every word of it. And underneath all of it was the simpler, uglier truth, the one I could only look at sideways, which was that I was ashamed. I had opened the slab. I had left it standing open long enough for the cold air to go down. Whatever happened now, whatever came up out of that ground, I had a hand in it. And a man does not run toward a confession when he can run away from one and call it protecting people. So I played groundskeeper. I helped them organize. I knew that ground like the back of my own hand, and that made me useful. And useful men get trusted in a crisis. And so I knew where the well was and how the pump ran, knew which sections drained and which flooded, knew the cottage had 2 feet of solid stone between us and the world, and which trees would give us cover and which would give the things cover instead. I became the man who knew things, and the trust that bought me also bought me time to do the thing I decided I had to do, which was go back down into the dark and learn what was waiting before it stopped waiting. I went down on the 4th night the group was there, after the watch changed at the gate and the last of the cottage lanterns went dark. I told the man on watch, young Pete Cadiz, that I was going to check the back wall, which was half the truth at least. I went to the slab in the old section, stepping careful between the leaning founder's stones in the dark, and I got the bar under it and pried it up. And the warm air that came up to meet me this time was not as warm as before, noticeably cooler, the difference a man feels on his face when a fever finally breaks. The generators were losing, and I went down the 31 stairs into the red light with my flashlight and my pry bar and a small notebook of my own this time. The kind I kept for the plot records, because I decided that if I was going to understand this thing, I was going to write it all down properly, the way a man should, the way the dead men before me had kept their log right up until the night they ran. The recording still played in the corridor. Containment integrity nominal. It lied now, and I knew that it lied, and still it played its calm, flat lie into the dark. In the control room, the monitors told the truth the recording wouldn't. The left-hand cell, the one that had held the still patient thing with its head cocked over, was empty. I stood and stared at it. The glass was whole. The cell door was sealed shut, the indicator beside it still glowing a steady green. But the cell was empty, and on the floor near the drain there was a dark, dragged smear. And I understood, with a slow drop in my stomach, that the cold had reached that cell first, somewhere below the others. And the cold had not made that thing docile. The cold had made it desperate. And a desperate thing, given enough time and enough hunger, finds the one weakness in any cage that men ever built. I scanned across the other feeds, my pulse going hard in my throat, hunting through grainy gray rooms, corridors, a lower stairwell I hadn't even known was down there. And on a feed marked in the corner, sub-level 2, I found it. The thing from the left cell, standing at the very bottom of that lower stairwell, facing up the steps, its head cocked again, patient again now that it had found a direction, now that it had somewhere to go. It was below me. It had gotten out of its cell and down into the deeper guts of the facility. And it was working its way up the same way water works up through bad ground, slow and certain, and finding every gap, every seam, every weakness. And the only thing standing between it and the stairwell I was breathing in was a series of doors. And those doors ran on the same dying power that fed the red lights. The same power coughing its way to empty in the generator bank below. I want to tell you I turned and ran. I didn't. I did the thing that 19 years of careful, measured work had built into the grain of me. I stayed long enough to understand the system, because understanding the system was the only weapon a man with a pry bar had. The control room had a master panel along one wall, old but well labeled, every switch and gauge marked in the same dry institutional hand. And a man who spent his life reading the dry institutional language of permits and burial records and county forms can read a control panel like a familiar page. Sublevels 1 through 3. Holding cells, 6 of them. 2 marked, occupied in faded label tape per the original log. Containment doors, each one running off its own separate circuit, each circuit with its own little indicator light, half of them already dark. And the generators, a bank of 3, with a fuel gauge that read just a hair above the bottom peg, and a single word stenciled in red across the housing of the whole panel that turned my stomach over cold. Cascade. There was a procedure beside it, laminated in yellowed plastic and bolted flat to the wall. The kind of last resort instruction a man only ever writes for the genuine end of everything. In the event of total containment failure, it read, the facility may be sealed permanently by triggering a cascade collapse of the access shafts, detonating charges placed during original construction in the support columns of sublevels 1 through 3. The charges are original to the structure. The trigger is located in this control room, behind the protective glass cover, a single keyed initiate switch. Engaging it will drop the entire facility in upon itself and bury all contents beneath an estimated 1,000 tons of structural rock and the overburden above, a way to end the place that had only been built to wait. Right there on the wall. But the laminated card had one more line at the bottom, and it wasn't printed. It was handwritten, in that same small, cramped, desperate hand as the last entry in the log. The hand of a man writing the last true thing he meant to leave behind. It said, "Cascade will not fire on generator power. Requires mains draw. Mains cut at substation day 1, on order. We could not end it. Whoever comes after us and reads this, you will have to find another way, or you will have to finish what we could not." The cut mains. They'd disabled the one mechanism in the world that could destroy the place, and then they'd run, leaving it warm and waiting. I didn't understand why a man at the end of everything would cut his own only weapon until I went back to the desk and read deeper into the early dry pages of the log that I'd skimmed past the first time. And there, buried in the routine, I found it. The cascade had a flaw, a fatal one, and they'd known it. The charges were placed for collapse, yes, but the seismic modeling, run and rerun, in the margins of 3 different pages in 3 different hands, showed that the collapse would breach the upper containment before it sealed the lower. A gap. A window of roughly 90 seconds, the notes said, during which the holding cells would unlock and open to the access shafts before those shafts finally came down. 90 seconds in which everything still alive inside would be free and climbing, while the building fell down around it. They had cut the mains rather than risk a cascade that might let the specimens loose before it managed to bury them. So the only way to end the place was also for 90 seconds. The way to release it for a minute and a half. The worst things on Earth would be loose and rising before the roof came down on top of them. And the roof, I stood there and made myself say it plainly in my own head. The roof was my cemetery, with 23 living people camped in tents on top of it. I sat down in the righted swivel chair with the thin, warm air going thinner around me, and I understood the exact shape of the trap the dead men had left me. I could leave it sealed and wait for the generators to die on their own. And then the things would get out slow, one at a time, through the gaps, the way the left cell one already had. And they'd climb and find a way and reach the surface eventually, with no warning at all, and no defense ready for him. Or I could go down to the valley and the substation and fix the mains, restore the power to the cascade, and bring the whole thing down on purpose, on my own schedule, with my own hand, with the absolute certain knowledge that for 90 terrible seconds, I'd be opening the worst cages ever built directly under the feet of every soul I'd spent the week pretending to protect. A slow, uncertain release I'd never see coming, or a fast, controlled release I could at least try to plan around. That was the whole of it. There was no third door. The men who built the place had made very sure of that. And then they'd left me their notes about it, which I've decided since was the only mercy and the only cruelty they had left to give. I went back up the stairs before the gaps between the generator surges got long enough to truly frighten me, and I sealed the slab down behind me, and I lay awake the rest of that night, not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I was planning. A man does what he knows. I knew holes and timing, and the weight and behavior of Earth, the way a dug hole slumps and a filled one settles, and a collapse finds its angle of rest. If I was going to do the second thing, the controlled thing, I needed to know precisely where in the cemetery those 90 seconds would happen, and precisely where they wouldn't. And I needed 23 people standing somewhere those 90 seconds couldn't reach. Morning came up cold and clear, and I started quietly between the chores that kept me useful to learn the mains. The feed ran from a junction at the base of the hill. I worked out over 2 days by tracing the only armored conduit I could find. It ran buried along the old access road, a heavy cable I'd always lazily assumed served the cemetery's few lights. it didn't. There were no cemetery lights on that line, never had been. I'd strung the few we had off the cottage propane generator years back. This cable ran straight past the gate and down the hill toward the valley floor and the substation 4 miles off. And the mains had been cut at the substation end, the log had said on day 1, on the order to abandon, to restore the cascade, to give the place the power to end itself. I would have to go down the hill, off our high ground, into the dying valley, into the town, to a substation that might well be surrounded by the very thing I was trying to bury, and physically reconnect a power line with my own hands. I am not a brave man. I want that understood plainly. I'm a careful one, which from a distance can look like the same thing and never is once you're up close to it. I spent 2 more days finding good reasons not to go, useful reasons, reasons that kept me busy and looked like leadership. And during those 2 days, the surge intervals on the generator down below stretched from a minute to nearly an hour. And on the second night, I went down the slab again and stood in front of the monitors. And the thing from the left cell was no longer at the bottom of the lower stairwell on the sub-level 2 feed. It was halfway up the steps, climbing. And on the feed for sub-level 1, the right cell thing, the hungry tracker, was standing at its glass with one long gray arm pressed flat against the inside of it, the fingers splayed. And as I stood there watching, the glass made a sound I could hear plainly through the camera's thin, tinny speaker. A long, high, rising creak. The sound of a seal beginning to fail. The cold was almost on them now, and when it arrived all the way, when the last of the warmth bled out of those white rooms, they were not going to be patient anymore. The patience was a thing the warmth gave them, and the warmth was almost gone. I told the group the next morning that I had to go down to the substation. I didn't tell them the real why of it. I told them, standing by the well in the cold sun, that the cemetery's well pump ran off a feed that had failed, and that if I could get power restored at the substation, we'd have running water again, which mattered to all of them in a way nothing else did, because the Vance baby was burning up with fever, and Doc Pruitt was down to rationing the clean water we had in jugs. It was a good lie, because it was useful, and because it made me look like a man willing to risk his own neck for the group, rather than what I was, which was a man trying with everything he had to undo a thing he'd done. Will Hatcher said flatly that he'd come with me, rifle and all, and I let him. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 on a road full of the infected. And because I think, somewhere underneath all the careful planning, I simply did not want to do the next part of it alone. We took my truck down the hill in the gray before dawn, headlights off, running on the cold blue light. Will rode shotgun with the deer rifle laid across his knees, and the window cracked 2 inches so he could hear over the engine. The valley road was bad, worse than the last time anyone had driven it. Cars sat nosed into the ditches at wrong angles, doors hanging open, one with the dome light still burning weakly inside on an empty seat. A farmhouse off to the east burned slow and orange, with nobody anywhere near it fighting the flames. And the infected, in 1s and 2s at first along the road's shoulders, standing in dooryards and field gates with that same wrong stillness the things behind the glass had, and then turning to track us as we rolled past, heads coming around slow and then fast, the way a compass needle swings to find north. We didn't stop. Will didn't fire unless he had to, and twice he had to, leaning out the cracked window with the rifle, and the crack of it in that dead valley was the loudest and most awful thing I'd heard in days, rolling off the hills and coming back. The substation sat behind a sagging chain-link fence at the valley floor. A fenced yard of transformers and steel frames and ceramic insulators, and the low live hum of the few circuits still carrying current, I knew just enough about it to be a danger to myself. The mains feed up to the hill ran through a single heavy disconnect, a great gray-handled switch the size of a man's torso, mounted on a steel frame, and it stood thrown to the open position, pulled by hand, by whoever had been sent down on day one to cut it. To restore the cascade's power, all I had to do was walk in there and throw it closed. All I had to do. As if there weren't already 6 infected inside the fence line, drawn in by the live hum of the transformers, drifting slow between the steel frames and the half-light, like men sleepwalking. And as if Will Hatcher hadn't chosen that exact moment, crouched beside me behind the cover of a parked service truck, to finally ask me the question I'd been dreading the whole way down the hill. "Tom," he said, low and even, rifle up and sweeping the yard, not looking at me. "Why's a well pump need the mains thrown clear down here at the substation? Cemetery's been on town water since before either of us could walk. There's no well pump." I'd underestimated him. People do that with quiet men. They forget that a quiet man isn't quiet because there's nothing going on behind his eyes. They forget he's been watching everything the whole time and just hasn't bothered to say so. I could have lied to him again. I was good at it by then. I'd had a week of practice. But I was crouched in a yard full of the infected with a switch in front of me that would bury a facility full of monsters, and maybe a few of us along with them. And I was so tired of carrying the whole thing alone that it had become a physical weight, a thing in my chest, and Will Hatcher had just killed 2 men on the drive down to keep me breathing, so I told him. Right there, crouched behind the service truck with the things drifting 20 feet off between the transformers, in a fast, low whisper with my mouth close to his ear. I told him all of it. The slab, the 31 stairs, the red lights and the vault door, and the recording that lied, the cells and the gray things, and the cold reaching them, the cascade and the 90 seconds, and the mains they'd cut. The thing I'd done by leaving the slab open that first night, and the thing I was about to do, right now, by throwing the switch. He listened the whole way through with his jaw working slow and his eyes never once leaving the infected in the yard. And when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. 3 breaths. 4. And then he said the thing that I have not been able to set down since, not for one day. "You're telling me," he said, still soft, still even, "that the safest looking place in the whole valley is the most dangerous place in the world. And you knew it. And you marched 23 people up onto the lid of it and let them pitch their tents. And now you want to blow it while they're standing on top." "Not while they're standing on top," I said. "That's the whole point of the planning. We get them off it first. We move everyone down to the south wall, the lower section, the new ground. The collapse zone is the old section, the back where the founders are. I've read the seismic notes 10 times. If they're all down at the south wall when it goes, the 90 seconds happens 100 yards from them, behind 2 stone walls, downhill, and we put down anything that comes our way before it ever reaches them. And if you're wrong about where the collapse zone is?" I didn't answer him, because the honest answer was that I was a grave digger reading a dead engineer's margin notes by flashlight. And I could be wrong about any part of it or all of it. And if I was wrong, I'd be opening the worst cages ever built directly under sleeping families. And there would be no taking it back. Will looked at the gray switch on its steel frame a long time. Then he looked at me, and there was no anger in his face, which was a great deal worse than anger would have been. There was just weight. The flat, settling weight of a man recalculating, in one moment, everything he'd let himself believe he was safe from. "Throw it," he said at last. "But not today. We get them moved first. We do this thing right, or we don't do it at all. And Tom, he held my eyes hard now. You tell them, all of it. Before we do this, you stand up in front of every one of them, and you tell them what's under their feet. And you let them decide whether they stay on that hill, knowing what they're standing on. You don't get to decide that for them again. You did it once already. You don't do it twice. He was right. He was completely and entirely right. And it cost me more to nod and agree to it than anything had cost me in years. Because telling them meant standing up in front of 23 people I had lied to all week. And showing them, in full daylight, the exact shape of the man who'd done the lying. We threw the switch close together, Will covering me with the rifle while I got both hands on the cold gray handle and hauled it down through its arc until it seated home with a heavy mechanical chunk. The substation hum changed pitch under us, deepened, took on a new load, and somewhere 4 miles up the hill, a dead facility took its first breath of mains power in 11 days. And a cascade trigger sitting behind a glass cover in a buried control room came alive in the dark. Then we ran for the truck, because the chunk of the switch and our movement had turned every infected in that yard toward us at once. All 6 heads swinging, all 6 bodies gathering and lunging. And Will spent 4 rounds buying us the gap to the gate and the truck doors. And I drove that road back up the hill faster than any sane man drives a road like that. And behind us, the valley filled up with the wrong, fast, scrambling movement of things that had hurt us and meant to follow. We made the cemetery gate at full gray daylight. And I did the thing Will made me promise. I had Pete Cadiz ring the old handbell by the cottage that we'd agreed meant gather. And they came, all 23 of them, the Cadiz sisters and the Vances with their fevered baby and old Doc Pruitt leaning on his cane and all the rest. And I stood up on the cottage step where every one of them could see my face, and I told them. I told them everything I'd told Will down in that substation yard. I watched it land on them. I watched the careful trust I'd spent a week building turn to something cold and stricken on 23 faces. And I made myself stand there and let it. Because Will was right, and they had earned the truth of it even this late in the day. There was shouting, of course there was. Mike Vance came up off the ground and came at me with his fists, and Will stepped in between us and took him by the shoulders and held him. Doc Pruitt sat down hard on the nearest headstone like his old legs had simply quit under him. The Cadiz sisters held on to each other and stared at me. And in the middle of all of it, under the shouting and the noise, with the cold sun on my face, I felt the ground. It was cold now. Through my boots, the back section ground that had been warm enough to melt the frost 11 nights ago was cold. Colder than the air around it, the heat all bled away. And standing there with my secret finally spilled out and the group coming apart at the seams around me, I knew. The generators down there had finally died. The last of the fuel was gone, the last surge surged and faded, and the cold had finished its long crawl into the cells. And whatever patience the warmth had bought those things across 100 years was spent. The slab, 100 yards back at the old wall, made a sound. It was a soft, pneumatic sigh. The exact sound it made when it sealed shut, except this time, it ran in reverse. And even over the shouting, several heads turned hard toward it. Because the human ear knows a wrong sound the instant it hears one, knows it in the spine before the mind catches up. The slab that I had sealed down tight was opening, from below, and there was no hand of mine on it. For 1 full second, nobody moved. 23 people and me, every one of us frozen in the flat, gray morning light, all our faces turned back toward the old section, toward the founders and the loggers and the 11 diphtheria children, where a flat stone slab was rising up on its hidden hinge with no living hand anywhere near it, pushed up from underneath by something that had finally, after 100 years in the warm dark, run clean out of reasons to keep waiting. Then the screaming started, and it was not coming from any of us. I had planned for 90 seconds. I had planned to move all 23 of them down to the south wall, to fire the cascade on my own schedule with my own hand, to control the release down to the minute. I'd planned it the way I always planned everything, carefully, completely, the way you measure and dig a grave. And the dead engineer's facility, with that awful patience built into its bones, had simply waited until I'd gone down the hill and thrown the switch that gave it power. And then it had opened its own door before I was anywhere near ready, because the cold had given it leave. And the things down there did not run on my schedule and never had. I'd only ever been fooling myself that they might. "South wall," I shouted, and my voice cracked clean down the middle of it. "Everybody, the south wall, behind me, go, move, now." To their everlasting credit, terror makes some people freeze and it makes others obey. And that morning, it made these good people obey. They ran. Will got them moving, shoving the slow ones, hauling Doc Pruitt up off his headstone, herding them all downhill. The Vances ran with the baby clutched between them. The Cadiz sisters half carried the old man between them, his cane forgotten in the grass. All of us poured down the slope away from the old section toward the lower south wall 100 yards off. And behind us, at the open mouth of the slab, the first of them came up into the daylight. I only got one good clear look, and one was more than enough for a lifetime. It came up the stairs the same way I had come up them, hand over the rail, but faster, far faster. And it rose up to its full wrong height at the top, and stood there a moment in the gray light. The right cell one, the hungry tracker. Its long gray arms hung loose at its sides, its head cocked over, and even at that distance I watched it tilt its face up and tasting the air. The air full now of 24 living, sweating, terrified people, and the smell of cut grass and cold earth, and the wide open sky it had been built and kept and fed to be forever shut away from. 100 years it had stood behind that glass and waited. Looking at it, stand there in the daylight, I did not get the sense it had wasted 1 minute of that time. Then it came down off the slab and into the cemetery, fast and low, weaving between the headstones with a horrible flowing economy. And behind it the second one came up out of the dark, and a third behind that. And I stopped looking and ran, because the cascade trigger I'd built my whole plan around was 100 feet straight down the open stairwell, directly behind those things. And reaching it from below had been the entire plan. And that plan was now standing between me and the stairs, with its arms hanging loose and its head cocked over, and a week of starvation driving it. This is the part where the planning ran out, and this is the part where I'll tell you exactly what I did. And you can be the judge of whether I made the right call, because I have asked myself the same question every single day since, and I still do not have a clean answer for you. The trigger was below. I could not reach it. There was no reaching it now, not through 3 of those things on a stairwell. But the cascade, the laminated card on the wall, had said, fired from the control room panel. And the control room panel ran on the mains I just restored down in the valley. And there was one other thing on that panel I had not let myself think about all week, because thinking about it meant accepting what it was going to cost me to use it. I'd read every labeled switch on that master panel twice over, the way I read everything, because I am a man who does not do one single thing by guess if there's a way to know. And bolted to the inside of the stairwell wall, right up at the top, just below the slab, weatherproofed in a gray steel box I'd glanced at and dismissed both times I came up those stairs, was a secondary panel. I'd read its label and not understood it. Surface arm, emergency cascade initiate. For exactly this. For exactly the case where the control room could not be reached because the thing you'd built the whole place to hold was loose in the corridors between you and it. The dead men had built one mercy into their merciless place. A single way to fire it from the top, from the surface, from the open air. And the top of the stairs, the open slab, the gray steel box, was precisely where the things were coming up. I told Will to get every one of them behind the south wall, and to keep them there no matter what they heard me doing, or what came of it. I told him that if I wasn't back at the wall in 5 minutes, to assume I wasn't coming back at all, and to take the whole group out down the old back trail to the river road, and not to look behind him, not once, no matter what. He grabbed my arm hard, and I twisted it free of him, and I went. Back up the slope toward the open slab and the gray things, with my pry bar in my fist, which against those long gray arms was worth about as much as a whispered prayer. I'm not going to dress up what the next few minutes were. I went sideways across the slope, between the headstones, using the granite the way you use cover in a fight, the way I'd watched Will use the transformers down in the substation yard. Keeping the solid bulk of 19 years of other people's grief between me and the things moving through the old section, they were drawn downhill, away from me, toward the noise and the warm smell of the group fleeing for the south wall. And that bought me a clear corridor up the far side, and I took it at a low crouch with my heart slamming against my ribs, and the cold ground hard and unforgiving under my hands, where I dropped to crawl the last open stretch of it. The slab stood wide open, the dark mouth of it breathing the last of its warmth up into the morning. And the gray steel box was exactly where the label said it would be, set into the lip of the stairwell, weatherproofed and patient and waiting for a hand. I got the cover up on its little hinge. The keyed switch was there under it, and below the switch a single press and hold initiate button, and a small dark indicator light beside it. And I had no key. They'd built a surface arm, and they'd put a lock on it, and the key was in the pocket of some engineer who'd run for his life 11 days ago. And I was crouched at the open throat of the worst place on the face of the earth, with a steel pry bar and no key. And 20 feet down the slope behind me, one of the things had stopped tracking the group and turned, slow, its cocked head coming around toward the new movement up near the slab. Toward me. A keyed switch is only a switch with a lock wrapped around it. And a man who has spent 19 years with a pry bar in his hands knows, down in his bones, that a lock is nothing but two pieces of metal held together by a little spring until enough honest force tells them otherwise. I jammed the flat blade of the bar into the seam of the cover plate, and I threw my whole body and all 19 years and every ounce of fear in me down onto it. And the cover sheared clean off its little hinge with a crack like a gunshot. And the keyed switch sat there, bare in its housing. I drove the bar into the switch itself and twisted hard. And the cheap lock cylinder turned past its stop with a snap, and the switch rolled over to arm. And the small dark light beside it went to a hard, steady, beautiful red. Armed, and the thing came up the slope at me, fast and low and flowing between the stones. Those long gray arms reaching out ahead of it. And I put my thumb flat on the initiate, and I pressed it down and held it. There was no explosion. That's the thing nobody who hasn't stood over one ever knows. The charges were 100 feet straight down, set deep in the support columns of 3 buried sublevels. And what I heard first was not a bang at all, but a deep, wrong, muffled cough far down under the soles of my boots. A sound felt more than heard. And then the ground dropped. Not all at once. The old section went first. The founders and the loggers and the 11 diphtheria children, the whole back quarter of the cemetery sinking inward, all together like dry sand running out the neck of an hourglass. The leaning headstones tilting further and then toppling, and then sliding away down into a hole that opened in the earth with a long grinding roar of falling rock. And a column of gray dust punched straight up out of it into the morning sky. The thing that had been coming up the slope at me lost its footing as the ground heaved and tilted under it. And it went down, down into the opening throat of the hole, with its long arms still reaching toward me to the last. And I scrambled backward off the lip on my hands and my heels as the crumbling edge of the collapse came chasing after me across the grass, and I felt the heat of it on my face, the buried 100-year heat, finally all coming up at once, released into the cold, bright morning as the place that had only ever been built to wait finally, at long last, ended. And in those 90 seconds, the exact 90 seconds the dead engineers had warned about in their margins, the window between the cells unlocking and the shafts coming down, I saw them. 2 more, climbing. Gray arms hauling up through the boiling dust, rising up out of the collapsing hole as fast as the hole could try to swallow them back down. Racing the falling rock up toward the daylight and the open air and the south wall and the people behind it. The dead men had been right about every second of it. For 90 seconds, the worst things ever made were loose and climbing. And the only thing left in all the world standing between them and 23 living souls was a roof made of 1,000 tons of falling rock. The rock won. Barely. By the count I have kept and recounted in my head 1,000 times since. 2 of them very nearly made the surface. One of them close enough that I saw its full face in the clean daylight. The flat gray of it, the eyes before the shaft under it gave way and dropped and took it down. And the roar went on for what felt like a year and was likely no more than 10 seconds. And then, all at once, it stopped. When the dust began to settle and drift off downwind, where the old section had stood for 140 years, there was a crater, its sides already finding their gentle slumping angle of rest, the way loose earth always does. A faint warmth steaming up out of the bottom of it into the cold air. The slab was gone. The 31 stairs were gone. The red lights and the vault door and the control room and the cells and the recording that lied about its containment, all of it. 100 feet straight down now, under more weight of rock and earth and the broken bones of the founders than anything living could ever shift. The place that waited had stopped waiting, because I had given it back the power to end itself, and then forced its own last mercy with a stolen swing of a pry bar. And the cost of it was a steaming hole where a quarter of my cemetery used to be, and the certain knowledge, mine to keep forever, that for 90 seconds I had opened the very cages I was trying to bury. I lay there at the crater's edge a long time, on my back in the wet grass, with the dust drifting down on me like gray snow. And I couldn't have stood if the world depended on it. Then I heard Will's voice, calling my name from down the slope. And behind his voice, the others at the south wall. And they were alive. All 23 of them, every soul, because the collapse zone had fallen exactly where the dead engineer's notes said it would. In the old back section, a clean 100 yards and 2 solid stone walls and a downhill grade away from where I'd put them. I had been right about the one single thing I most needed in this world to be right about. The grave I'd dug had turned out to be the exact right size, not an inch too long, not an inch too short. We didn't stay. You cannot stay on a hill that has just swallowed a quarter of itself, with a valley full of the infected climbing the road below you and the sweet, rotten smell of that buried heat still rising up out of the steaming crater. We took the old back trail down to the river road, the same way I'd told Will to take them if I never came back, except I had come back. And we went down out of the high country together, 24 of us. With the Vance baby finally gone quiet against its mother's chest, the fever broken or just worn out. And Doc Pruitt walking under his own power with a hand on Lupe Cadiz's shoulder, and the two sisters bickering at each other in low, fierce voices, the way people do when they're somehow still alive and can't quite make themselves believe it. Nobody thanked me. I need that understood because it's part of the true shape of this, and I won't leave it out to make myself look better. They knew what I'd done, the whole of it, the lie and the open slab, and the week I'd kept them camped on a lid I knew was coming loose. Will had made me tell them, and I'd told them. And they walked down that hill alongside me, but they walked a little apart from me too, a step or two of clear space that nobody closed. And I understood it, and I didn't hold it against a single one of them. Trust, once you've spent it the way I'd spent theirs, doesn't just come back because the thing happened to work out in the end. They were alive because of me, and they were alive in spite of me. And both of those were true at the same time. And a man has to learn to carry two true things at once, or the carrying of them will break him in half. I've had a lot of practice carrying them since. We've kept moving in the months since. It's most of a year now. We found other people along the way, and lost some more. And we've built something that from a certain angle, in a certain light, looks almost like safety. In a place I won't name for the very same reason I won't name the town or the valley. Will and I don't talk about the cemetery. We've never once said the word Cascade out loud to each other since. Doc Pruitt passed in the spring, peaceful in his sleep, no fever and no teeth at his throat, the only one of all of us so far to get an ending like that. And we buried him proper, and I dug the hole myself, and I made it the exact right size. The Vance baby is walking now, into everything, laughing. There's that at least. There's that. But here is the thing I carry that wakes me in the dark, the thing the rest of them don't know to carry. The dead engineer's logbook said Station 9. Station 9, which means there were at least 8 others. 8 other facilities, somewhere out there in this country, built the same patient, careful way, buried under the same kind of old, undisturbed ground that nobody on Earth ever digs into, full of the same patient gray things, kept warm by the same banks of generators that ran on the same fuel that ran out, in the same way ours did, 11 days into the same outbreak. And nobody put a pry bar to those slabs. Nobody read those logs by flashlight. Nobody went down those stairs to learn the system, and nobody threw those switches. The generators in those 8 other places are long dead now. All of them. Months dead. The cold reached those cells a long time ago, and whatever came up out of those 8 other quiet old graveyards came up slow, the way the left cell one came up, through the gaps and the seams, with no warning and no controlled collapse, and no gravedigger who happened to feel the ground breathe under his boots on a cold October night. Up and out into towns and valleys, full of people who never once knew, not for a single day of their whole lives, that they had been sleeping on a lid. I felt the ground breathe under my cemetery on the 11th night of the end of the world, and I've wondered every day since how many other people, in how many other quiet little towns just like mine, felt that same impossible warmth come up through the soles of their boots on a cold, dark night and told themselves, the way I did, that it was nothing, that it was a broken gas line. The sensible answer. The one a man reaches for in the dark when the true answer is just too big to hold in his 2 hands. If your town has an old graveyard, the kind so old that nobody living remembers who's buried in half the graves, I'd keep off it on a cold night, And if you ever feel the dead ground go warm under your feet where it has no business being warm, don't do the thing I did. Don't go looking. Some things are buried that deep under the patient dead for the simplest reason there is, which is that the dead are the only thing on this earth patient enough to keep them. But you'll go looking anyway. I know you will, because I know how this works now, because I did. And I had everything to lose, and not one thing in the world to gain. And I went down all 31 of those stairs into the red light just the same. A man with a question burning a hole clean through him will walk into anything. I just hope, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, however far away from me and mine, that the ground under your own 2 feet stays cold.